Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back with you all. So, I had a theme today, and it was going to be, focus on the Jews of Chelm. Has anyone heard of the Jews of Chelm before? The Jews of Chelm. They're the most foolish town in the world, and we'll get to that. But a friend this morning reminded me of one of my favorite stories, and it's really just, it wants to get out. So I'll tell this story first, and then we'll move on to Chelm. Not so long ago, in a little town somewhere, there was a tailor named Shlomo. Because all good Jewish tailors are named Shlomo, right? Now, Shlomo was not a wealthy man. He was the town tailor. He had steady work, but he never had enough money for fabulous clothing or a big house or anything of that nature. But as a tailor, there was one thing that he could do very, very well, and that was make clothes. So with money he had saved up in his early years, he made himself a beautiful jacket, a beautiful coat, lined with silk, beautiful patterns, right? Special stitching. He even put his initials on the inside of the lapel. And Shlomo loved that coat so much, and year after year, day after day, he wore this coat. And like all things, it eventually became tattered, and it lost some of its luster. And Shlomo's wife said, "Shlomo, I wish you would just throw that shmata out. Throw that rag out." And he says, No. I can make something from this. So he takes the coat, and he snips, and he cuts, and he sews, and he fashions the bits of the coat that are still good into a nice vest. Now Shlomo walks around day after day, year after year with this beautiful vest. And everyone comes to know Shlomo and his beautiful vest. And they know that at one point it was a jacket, but that Shlomo had to make a vest out of it to preserve its beauty. But of course, like all things with time, it became tattered and torn, and the color started to fade. And Shlomo's wife said, "For God's sake, please, you had the jacket, you had this vest, throw the shmata out, throw the rag out." And he says, "Oh, no. I can make something of this." So he takes the strip of cloth that maybe wasn't rubbed up against his sides so many times, and it still has some color, some shine to it. And he takes that strip of cloth and he fashions it into a beautiful necktie. So now Shlomo walks around town, and all the people know him for this beautiful necktie. They know it was a jacket and that he made it into a vest, and now it sat upon his neck beautiful and resplendent. And day after day, year after year, Shlomo would go about his life with this beautiful tie. But like everything else with time, the tie became tattered and faded. And as I'm sure you can guess, Shlomo's wife said, "For God's sake, Shlomo, throw the shmata out, throw the rag out. It's time. You can't possibly do something with this necktie." He says, "Just you wait and see. I can always make something out of nothing." And so he takes a little bit of cloth and he wraps it around a button, and he makes a beautiful little button, just a small reminder of this beautiful jacket that he once had. And he sews the button onto a new jacket. And he walks around town year after year. Eventually, the button, of course, too falls apart, as all things do. And Shlomo's wife says, "Finally, there is nothing left for you to make something out of. Nothing left. You can't save a piece of that little button." And Shlomo says, "That may be the case, but dear wife, Remember, I'm not just a tailor. I'm also a storyteller. So I can always make something out of nothing. The end. So that's a little bit of the inner life of a storyteller, right? Everything has the potential to be a great story. All right. With that being said, now I'd like to share a story about probably one of my favorite groups that are in Jewish folklore, the Jews of Chelm. Some of you may have heard of them, some of you may not, so I'm going to start at the very beginning. There was this town somewhere in Central Europe called Chelm. And the Jews in Chelm were like Jews anywhere else. Some of them wore kippot, some of them didn't. Some of them had long beards, some of them didn't. But for all intents and purposes, when you looked at this town, it seemed like a town of normal Jews. But there was a story that started going around. You see, these Jews were peculiar. When they had a cold winter and they ran out of firewood, they suffered and they froze all through the winter, and when spring finally came around, they said they got together in a big town meeting, and all the people furrowed their brows until they were all wrinkled like prunes. And the wisest men in Chelm came up with the idea, of course, we can't let this happen again. We'll build a brick wall around the city. That'll keep the cold out. Another story went around. And this story was that the people of Chelm had heard of the greatest organist in all the land. And they called for this organist. They said, please come to our town. They sent letters. And the organist came, only to find out that the people of Chelm had no idea what an organ was. These were the kind of people that lived in Chelm. Foolish. A little silly, maybe. Now, eventually, word got to the people of Chelm that the rest of the world was talking about them in this way. And they called a town meeting, and the mayor of the town model stood at the head of the town meeting, and he said, we cannot let this stand. We must send out the brightest Jew in all of Chelm, the brightest Jewish youth. We'll send him out to the world so that he can tell everyone. We're not foolish. Foolish things just happen to us. So the wise men of Chelm gathered, and for 7 days and 7 nights they pondered, who should we send? Who should we send? Well, he must be brilliant. He must exemplify the best of Chelm logic. So they decide, after 7 days and 7 nights, that they'll hold a contest. And all the brightest youths of Chelm come to the contest, and one by one they're asked various logic questions. But it becomes very apparent that there's really only one man for the job, and his name is Gimple. Now, Gimple was already known as a relatively smart guy. You see, they told this story about Gimple that one time he had buttered his bread, and he dropped the bread. And we all know that bread falls butter side down. And so the bread fell, and Gimple said, no. The butter was just on the wrong side of the bread. So they knew Gimple was smart, but just to test him, they said, Gimple, if it's 4 miles from Chelm to Shedlitz, 4 miles, how many miles is it then back from Shedlitz to Chelm? And Gimple thinks. The answer's obvious. It's 8 miles. The mayor model knows, of course, this is the correct answer, but for the benefit of all who were present, he wanted Gimple to explain his logic. Please explain. Well, you see, There are 4 months from Hanukkah to Passover, and then 8 months to get from Hanukkah back to Passover again. So the trip from Chelm to Shedlitz, 4 miles. Trip from Shedlitz back to Chelm, 8. Made perfect sense. Okay, Gimple, let's just check your logic one more time before we let you go. Why is it that the summer days are long and the winter days are short? A twinkle appears in Gimple's eye. He knows this. He knows this. He's a learned man. And he says, of course, in the summer it's hot. The days expand. And in the winter it's cold and the days contract. A huge smile breaks out and everyone starts clapping. Oh, Gimple, you're so smart. You're, of course, the guy for the job. So they send Gimple out and they give him the finest clothes that they can put together. They give him the finest horses for his wagon. And Gimple goes out and he goes from town to town to spread the word of the wisdom of the Chelm people. Eventually he notices something. Every town that he comes across has a town record. A record of all the events that took place in town. Gimple thinks to himself, well, maybe that's the difference. Maybe the difference is that Chelm does not have a town record to record the goings-on so that people of the world can see truly how wise the people of Chelm were. And so Gimple makes his way back after years of travel and he explains this to the town council. And from that day on, they kept a town record. Now, many, many years later, another Jew was rummaging around in his grandmother's attic. And he found a box. And in that box, he found a bunch of yellowed pages crinkled on the ends. And at the top was written, the town record of Chelm, and that is how we have their stories today. So that's a first Chelm story. You can see it's not only are we supposed to laugh at the foolishness, right, of the Chelmites, but it's also kind of a way to laugh at ourselves, right? A way to laugh at the way that we explain, our laws and precepts, right? So, I think I've got one more Chelm story that I can share. So, the Chelmites, right, we know we're only 4 miles away from the town of Shedlitz. Shedlitz was a normal town. They had Jews that looked just like Jews anywhere else. But Shedlitz had a watermill. And so once a week, the Chelmites would go from Chelm, walk the 4 miles to Shedlitz, grind their grain, and come back. One time, at a town meeting, Gimple, who we know to be the smartest man in Chelm, stands up at the town meeting and says, "It is ridiculous that we spend so much time traveling to and from Shedlitz just so we can grind our grain. Chelm is the greatest town in all the world. We have the wisest people. Should we not have our own watermill? Should we not have our own watermill as a symbol?" And everyone in the town says, "Well, of course. That's a great idea, Gimple." And so they go about gathering materials. They realize they don't have enough wood, so they take down the schoolhouse. They realize they don't have enough stone, so they take down a couple storehouses around, the outside of town. Eventually, they all pool their money together and resources, and the brightest minds in Chelm come up with a plan. Of course, Chelm has to be seen as the greatest town, and Chelm is in a valley. We must build our watermill at the top of the highest mountain near Chelm. That way everyone else can see us and see how great we are. So they take all these resources that they've put together and they build a beautiful mill. Beautiful. The planks of the walls are perfectly straight. No cracks exist between them. The roof is beautiful and sturdy, and it's been painted a beautiful red. They use the finest oak trees to make the wheel that will grind the grain, and they even make sure to bring in special stone from Leipzig, and they carved out the middle to make the millstone. Everything was going perfectly. They labored day after day, and finally, after a long time, the mill was built. And so, Model, the mayor, being the mayor of the town, decides that, of course, he'll be the first person to start up the mill. The whole town gathers. Model pulls the lever to start the mill, and he expects a big noise as the mill begins to churn and grind, but silence. The wheel doesn't move. How could this be? We use the finest materials. We built it just like the mill in Shedlitz. Why isn't it working? So, Shlomi, he's not the wisest man in town, but he is a scientist of some renown. And he says, I see our problem. I see our problem. There's no light inside. There's no light inside of the mill. What do you mean there's no light inside of the mill? Well, you see, when there's no light, it's dark. And you know what happens in the darkness? Demons come about. And when demons come about, they interfere with the workings of men. It's clear to me that the mill is not working because there are goblins inside it stopping it from working. So, everyone in Chelm is in awe of Shlomi's assessment. And so they begin taking off some planks, right? And the children run outside with their bags and they capture some sunlight in the sacks. And they bring the sunlight into the mill and they open it up to let the light out. The adults do the same. They bring sunlight in big barrels, sacks, big containers. They all bring all this sunlight into the mill and they open it up. Model, the mayor, then pulls the lever, but it doesn't work. We don't have enough light. We must take off the roof. So they take off the roof. Again, Model goes to pull the lever. Nothing. The Chelmites have no idea what's going on. It's at that point that a little girl says, you know what? When I traveled with my dad to Shedlitz the other week, there was water that was on the wheel. And I think that the water would turn the wheel so that the grain would be ground. Chelmites say, obviously we need water. So all of the Chelmites form a line from the tippy top of this mountain all the way down to the stream in town. And one by one they hand buckets up the line and they pour the bucket on top of the wheel and they wait and they wait. And of course, the mill still doesn't work. So it's at this point that the Chelmites are exasperated. They've spent all of their money, all of their resources, and winter is coming. It's at that point that a traveler walks by and sees the Chelmites. And this traveler is well aware of the Chelmites' penchant for foolishness. And he says, you silly Chelmites, you fools. A water mill must be near the river. You must build it next to the river so that the river current pushes against the wheel and grinds the grain. The Chelmites laugh and say, what a fool. What good would it do to build a water mill right by the river? It'd get wet. So the man goes on his way, and the Chelmites are in a precarious situation. They have no food as the winter comes. And it was at that point, right, because there's a proverb that says, I believe it's the yarn will always come to the tailor and bread to the breadless, something like that. Anyways, that's what the Chelmites thought. And just at that moment, a very wealthy miller from out of town entered Chelm. But that's a story for another day. The end.
Thank you so much for watching, and before we close out, I also want to express my gratitude for the Jewish Home of Cincinnati, because all Jewish life programs, all Jewish everything going on here at Cedar Village is thank you so much to the Jewish Home of Cincinnati for providing the financial support for making all of this happen.